Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Brad Parks.
Hey there, how are you today?
Hey, Molly, I'm doing good. How did I do with the intro? Was that okay?
I mean, I know it's really hard. I know it's so taxing.
You give me so many lines, and how am I going to get all of them? I don't know.
It's impossible.
I mean, I lost sleep. Am I going to get it right? Am I going to trip? I mean, it's really rough. So I'm hoping it's all uphill from here.
Yeah, I mean, it was so hard to memorize those lines, especially.
Exactly. Too. I'm just sweating. I'm gonna have anxiety dreams about this later on.
All right. So can you tell me about your books?
Yeah, sure. So I write thrillers. I like to say I write kind of everyman thrillers, every person thrillers. I write thrillers about the kind of people you can meet in the grocery store. In other words, they're not X special anything. They cannot break your jaw by looking at it. They cannot hack computers with their toes. They are ordinary, flawed people who have these oftentimes perplexing and horrible things happen to them. And they react to those things the same way you and I would, by going, holy shit, and what am I going to do now? And panicking like any good, proper, normal human being would. So if there is a thread, my 11th novel, Unthinkable, just came out. And although the themes in my novels have kind of diverged widely and very different kinds of characters and everything like that, but if there is a thread with all of them, it is that. It is that you can meet all of the characters in the grocery store.
I love that so much. And I just love thrillers in general. And I think there's a place for having it be like, I'm an ex-special agent and stuff like that.
Sure. I love those books too.
But I love reading about people that it's like, I could know this person. What if this person was me? What if this person was my friend? Like, I think that's such an interesting idea in general.
Well, and I actually tried to write a book once with an ex-special something. And I started with Once Upon a Time, got all the way to the end, 110,000 words later, and kind of got to the end and realized, you know what? I never connected with this character at all. Because the character essentially became this accumulation of skills and backstory, but he was never anyone that I really could relate to. And I actually ended up throwing that book away because guess what? If I don't relate to the protagonist, how the hell are you going to relate to the protagonist, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a very painful and expensive way to learn the lesson of, these are the kind of books I need to be writing. For as much as I love to read those other books too, and somebody else is going to write those books, but that somebody else is not going to be me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and can we kind of circle back to you talking about throwing out an entire book? Wow. How did you get to the place where you realized this really does not work? And what was it like scrapping?
So Molly, I'm gonna go ahead and shock you right now. I've actually thrown away, if we're talking whole manuscripts, not just parts of manuscripts, because that's child's play. Thrown out whole entire manuscripts. I've thrown out 3 whole entire manuscripts. And the first time I was actually pretty calm about it. I was pretty sanguine. It was like, okay, this is what needs to be done. The second time, I always say that the first time I ever saw my dad cry was when his father passed away. The first time my kids saw me cry was when that book passed away. I really had a rough time. And then the third time, I think I dealt with it really the most mature way possible, which was I snapped at my children for no reason. I waited until my wife got home, and then I stormed out of the house so I could go to the grocery store and buy a box of cookies and eat them in the parking lot with tears streaming down my face. I think that's the recommended way to deal with hard feelings, isn't it?
Of course, yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad we're on the same page there. So I think you kind of realize, you only get so many bites at this apple when you're publishing as an author, and you want to make sure each bite is as good as it can be. And I don't want bad books out there with my name on them. I don't want, my books are going to be flawed enough, right? And they'll have flaws that I can't see, that my editors can't see, that it's a kind of, part of the process. Something that big is very, very, very infrequently going to be actually perfect. But I still want them to be as perfect as they can be, given what they are, right?
Yeah.
And so I like that's admittedly a pretty high bar. I also, if I can get deep with you for a moment, I'll always remember sitting with William Landy, Bill Landy, who wrote a wonderful book called Defending Jacob. And we were sitting at the bar at Thriller Fest, which is a wonderful conference that used to get held in New York City before the pandemic destroyed everything. And he and I was talking. I was actually making fun of him. He hadn't had a book out in a few years, and like, what's wrong with you? Yada yada. And he said, how old are your kids? And I, said their ages at that point, and they were still young. And he said, Brad, if you got hit by a bus tomorrow, the only way your children could actually get to know you as an adult is by reading your books. And when that's the standard, right? You're thinking about like, that's kind of the legacy that I'm leaving behind. Yeah, dude, I don't want them to suck. Okay, Molly, is that all right?
Yeah, I fully understand that. And like, I've had stuff before where it's like, I was working really hard on a project or working so hard, putting like my everything into something and then going, even as I was working on it, thinking, I am never going to release this, but I need to finish it. But also I'm never going to release this because it didn't meet
that's okay.
standard. Yeah.
Now I do when I talk to like kind of younger writers or at writers conferences and everything like that, I always kind of tell people to work against type, right? And so there are some people who need the encouragement to really push stuff out there. And you might be one of those, in which case you have to learn to let go. See, I was the opposite. Like my natural tendency, because I used to be a journalist, was, hey, when you're a journalist, you only get one draft. And I'm sorry, this is as good as I can make it in the time allotted. And the presses are running and let's go, and you hit the button, right? So that's my natural instinct. So that's why I've always known, now that I'm an author, I need to hold it back. I need to fight against the Brad that's just going to push it out there and instead say, no, like raise the bar, raise the standards. And that's why I end up throwing away those novels, because I like, and now I'm going to talk out of both sides of my face. We all, any kind of writer, no matter how good or bad or anything else you are, I believe, we all suffer from self-doubt. Or if I ever do meet a writer who doesn't suffer from self-doubt, I can almost 100% assure you they suck, right? It's like, I'm sorry. Like you have to, like, self-doubt is such a part of this, right?
Oh, yeah.
So there is a part of this game that is always going to be overcoming self-doubt and like essentially deluding yourself, right? Like, because I really believe that you have to sit down every day at the keyboard and believe, I am telling the right story. I am telling a story that is interesting to people. I am telling this story in the right way, and I am the right person to be telling the story. Like you really, you have to believe it, have conviction in that, in order to really move forward. And that does sometimes take an act of self-deception, right?
Yeah.
So, so this has come a long way around to, sometimes you have to push forward, and then sometimes you need to know when you throw it away. And going back to where we started, when you cannot connect with the main character, you have to throw that book away.
Yeah, and kill your darlings, even if it's like a plot too.
Right.
That happens all the time. So many people that I have on here tell me like, oh yeah, I had a completely different vision for this book. I had like a totally different plot, but I loved this one aspect. And so like, I kept going in that way.
Right. And that becomes the one thing you save from the draft that you otherwise immolate. Yeah.
I kind of want to go back to what you were just saying about being a journalist. How has that like helped your writing or hindered it? And like, are there any ways where it's like really glaringly different from writing a book?
Well, certainly as a journalist, if you make stuff up, you get fired versus as a fiction writer, if you don't make stuff up, you get sued. So they're very different in that respect. But the elements of storytelling don't really change that much, frankly, whether you're making it up or not. So in that way, being a journalist was amazing preparation for what I do right now. And in particular, during my young years, I was a sports writer. And if you know sports at all, look, in this modern day, everybody already knows the score of the game the instant it happens. And they've already seen the stats, and they've already gotten analysis. The kind of statistical analyses they do these days are just baffling, right? So your job as a writer then is to actually tell the story of what happened. Mm-hmm. And so every day you go to the arena, the ballpark, whatever, it's find a story, tell a story, find a story, tell a story. And that really builds amazing muscles of learning what makes a story go, and learning what are the elements that go into a great story. And the other thing it does is, you have to write a lot. Speaking of muscles, when I was a sports writer at various points in times, depending on my deadlines and what coast I was on and what time zone I was in and all this kind of stuff, I might end up writing 3,000 words a day, all for publication of various editions of the paper that we had that day. And when you do that day in, day out, you get really good at the process of transferring thoughts from your head onto the page. And that's essentially what writing is. Mm-hmm. So in that way, I don't know who I would be or what I would be like as a writer were it not for my journalistic experience. And the other thing, and this is advice I give to young writers all the time, before you do good writing, you have to do a lot of bad writing first. And I think I did a lot of my bad writing for newspapers. And that was a great way to kind of get over that and get, your goal as a writer is always to be looking at the stuff that you did 4, 5, 6 years ago and going, oh my God, that's crap. I'm so much better now. Right.
Oh yeah.
And I think I was probably on the steepest parts of that learning curve when I was a young journalist. So it was wonderful practice for me in all kinds of ways. And I, even though it's a really tough business to be in right now, just because of the economics of it, it's still great training for really anything else you want to do in your life.
That is really so fascinating. And I'm especially still like thinking over what you were just saying, like you have to do a lot of bad writing first. And like the other day I was talking to a friend of mine and we were looking over some of our old writing and like laughing at it from when we were like 7 or something. And it was terrible because we were very young. We still are, but our writing still sucks, but it was worse then. And she read me this one part of something that she wrote that she completely forgot about. And it was actually good, like really good. And both of us were so shocked because we're like, what is this? But like you find those gems after you do it so much. And after you're like really looking over something like that, like in the middle of it all, a lot of the time, at least from what I've found, is you find like a phrase or a scene or something that it's like, I want to use that.
See, although it's actually disconcerting to go back and read your early writing and find something good, because then it's like, oh my God, I used to be something. What's happened to me? My Lord. I'm really thankful that, most of my early writing kind of happened pre-internet. So there is no great record of really a lot of the bad writing I did, and I'm mostly thankful for that. But I suppose now and then I might find some wonderful turn of phrase that would make me realize I'm washed up at the age of 47.
Yeah, see, all of mine is like in Word documents and stuff right here on my computer. So, but it is just interesting looking back at things like that and seeing like, oh, it was bad, but it still served a purpose, and like kind of seeing the progression. Like I've done NaNoWriMo a lot, and I've looked at stuff where like at the beginning of the book, it's garbage. And then the last chapter is really good because I had been practicing for a month.
Right. And and you've gotten to know the characters, and I do believe writing is a muscle. Yeah. And at the end of a month of really vigorous working out, your muscles are stronger. They just are. And so, that's another thing I always tell young writers, like find ways to work the muscle, right? For me, that was journalism. That gave me the excuse to be writing every day. Cause, writing is hard, right? And it's not something that we necessarily like to do all the time.
Yeah.
And, the only way you're going to, and so it can be hard if you don't have a good reason to just say, I'm going to sit down and write. And, so yeah, get yourself in a position where, gosh, you have to write because you're the editor of that damn literary magazine and you're supposed to have a piece in the anthology. And therefore you must write something, right? Or you are, yes, you're writing for the school paper, or you've found some job at a PR agency. And even though, my gosh, some of the writing, you just feel like you're shoveling slop at the hog house. Nevertheless, you still have to write. And I'm a believer that building the writing muscle in one area does in fact transfer to another, even though the form may be different, even though the genre expectations or the expectations of the, whatever you want to call it are going to be different. It still does transfer, and it still does make you a better, writing press releases, believe it or not, will make you a better poet. And I believe that wholeheartedly.
I do as well. That was like, yeah, I'm definitely going to take a lot of this advice. And I really hope that the people listening to this are really like listening to what you're saying and some of this advice you're giving. So kind of on a different note, I want to talk a little bit about genre with you and how you got into thriller writing and like why thrillers?
Well, as a young person, and even now, I mean, my favorite vacation is going to be, let me throw 2 bathing suits and 7 books in a bag and go sit on the beach for a week. And, and those books that I'm going to throw in, they're going to be thrillers. I mean, it's always what I've loved. So, write what you know, write what you love. That's it. And then I think, and if we want to call the genre that I'm really in, I prefer the term crime fiction because it's a larger umbrella that fits more stuff. Crime is kind of endlessly fascinating to me. And it started being that. So after I was a sports writer for a number of years, I then switched over to news side, where I ended up writing about crime a lot. And the thing I always knew when I was covering crime is that there was a very good chance that I was interviewing someone on, frankly, the worst day of their life, right? Because their son had just been murdered, or they had just been a victim of a crime, or something awful had just happened. And taking a person from that point, the worst day of their life, that is where interesting things are happening in fiction. And I think that's a lot of what drives my crime fiction anyway, is exploring what happens to a person when you do put them under this ultimate stress, and see, because probably what happens to somebody on a typical boring Tuesday, it's not going to be that interesting. But what happens to them on those, those 10 days, they're always going to be, 10 days, 20 days, 50 days, whatever, those days in your life that you remember forever. Right. And I think those are where fiction is hatched, where you're really exploring character. And that's exactly what I want to put my characters through. And that's what I want them to be showing me in the book are those days in their lives that they'll remember forever.
I love that. And like, sometimes it can be hard to see when you're writing, because you can be like, no, I want it to show like what they do in their day-to-day lives. And it's like, no, you don't want that.
No. So that goes to another piece of writing advice I give. And it's actually, it's a takeoff on an Elmore Leonard line. Elmore Leonard said, you should cut the parts that readers skip. Right. And I always say, you should cut out the boring parts. Right. And I think oftentimes as writers, we tell ourselves that the boring parts need to be in there because, well, yes, it tells you what the character does on an ordinary day. And what does it look like when no, really, no, Molly, it doesn't need to be in there. Cut it out. It's boring, take that 2 to 3 to 4 page exposition and turn it into about a sentence and a half. Right. Going to the kill your darlings thing. Yeah. That's what you got to do and move on to the interesting stuff.
And sometimes it's an entire book that you have to take. Like what we were saying earlier, sometimes you just have to take out that little bit from an entire book and go, this does not work. And it is.
Okay. For example, my favorite book of all time, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. Did you read Go Set a Watchman?
No.
Okay, so this was the original version of To Kill a Mockingbird, which was, Go Set a Watchman. Mm-hmm. And okay, so here it is, written by, Harper Lee, my favorite writer of all time, because she wrote my favorite book of all time. And I'm reading Go Set a Watchman, and oh my God, it was dreadful. Because like the first 3 or 4 chapters were like a kind of a bad romance novel where, the characters just aren't getting together and you don't care and whatnot. And then it kind of muddles around after that. But there's a few scenes where the book really sparks, and it's when the character is remembering her youth, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was some really smart editor in New York who went, "Hey, Harper, that stuff is really good. What if you made a whole novel out of that stuff?" And that's how To Kill a Mockingbird was born. And so it was, I think maybe a chapter and a half or 2 chapters of Go Set a Watchman that ended up informing most of To Kill a Mockingbird. Mm-hmm. And voila, you have an immortal novel, because you took away all the drecky parts and just did the good parts. And there it is.
Yes. Or there's this one book that I love by Daniel Kraus, and it's The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch. And I've only read the first volume. I started the second one, did not finish it yet. But in the first volume, there were a couple moments where I'd be like, okay, I like thinking, okay, maybe I'm a little bit like done with this sort of premise where we are, because it spans over the course of 600 years.
Oh, okay. And then ambitious.
And I would be like, okay, I'm a little bit. And then every time I would start to think that, there would be something completely new that started and drew my attention right back in. And it was so interesting the way that worked, because you would think 600 years in a book is like way too much, and you won't possibly be able to not be bored hearing one person's life for that long. But it really, really was so engaging because of the way that it was written, and the fact that you didn't hear every single time the character had breakfast.
Right. Well, it's like I asked Ken Follett one time, and Ken Follett wrote Pillars of the Earth, which is he's written a bunch of terrific thrillers, but I was asking him about Pillars of the Earth, which is it's a book about the building of a cathedral, which happens over the course of 100 years, right? Mm. But he's also written a book like his. What was it? The Eagle Has Landed. I think that was the name. It was a World War II thriller, like historical thriller, but set in World War II. And it's like a parachute team dropping behind Nazi lines, right? And it takes place over the course of like frantic 72 hours or something like that. And I said, okay, so how do you write, this book? That was his breakout novel. It was, this action-packed 72 hours. And now suddenly you have this book that's taking place over 100 years. How do you do that from a pacing standpoint? And he's this very proper British gentleman. So he said, no, it's easy. You only write the interesting parts. So there it is. Only write the interesting parts.
That is the best writing advice.
There it is.
Like really it is. Only because I feel like at least I have this happen all the time where I get kind of caught up in like, oh, it has to have these specific beats, and you have to know everything about this person.
Yeah, but no. And the more I do this, the more I actually start to have faith in readers of they'll either fill in the blanks or it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Right. But either way, readers will bring things to your characters and will bring context and will absolutely assume things or just imagine things. And frankly, what they assume or imagine is just as good as what you would have put in there. So you don't need to, give them too much. Dare to give them too little. They'll do the work. Mm-hmm. Readers are smart people by and large.
And it will also leave your readers much more happy. Right. Too. Because then they would know oh, well, in my head, this happens. And it leaves room for that, as opposed to them going, well, I don't agree with this character choice. Right.
Exactly. Which, although readers are never going to agree with your character choices. That's an inevitable, natural. That's 90% of my bad reviews are because somebody disagreed with what a character did, as if And I actually, in a weird way, I take it as a compliment, because it does mean they engaged with the character and they cared about the character. They're just kind of disagreeing with the character in that way, that, the character has become like the cousin who is making lifestyle choices that they don't agree with. Mm-hmm. And therefore they're kind of down on the cousin or something like that. It's like, well, I know you would have wanted, Johnny to do this, but, the fact is Johnny did that instead, because that's what, you just kind of, sorry, you can't please everyone is the moral of that story.
It could also mean that they relate to the character too, because it's like, well, I wouldn't have done that. I
would have been so much smarter. It's like, yes, but I write dumb characters sometimes too. Okay.
We're trying to write like the every person. It's not
so my first 6 books were an investigative newspaper reporter who wrote about crime, and his name was Carter Ross. And I, kind of very much based him on me, and I'm terrible at solving the crime. I'm the guy at the end of every movie who's like, wait, the butler did it? Oh my God, I'm blown away. I didn't see that coming. And so, people would get frustrated of, how is Carter not better at putting together the pieces of this puzzle? Because I, dear reader, who read 240 mysteries a year, am excellent at putting the puzzle pieces together. And it took a while for people to understand. So either they just dropped the series because it got too frustrating, or they started understanding that, like, no, Carter's not. Like, he is going to blunder around. He is going to make mistakes. And he is, because he's not some genius at solving the puzzle. And I don't know. I like that when I'm reading that, like that, that the character does not have to be a genius. The character can make bad decisions, because that's frankly what most people in life actually do, right? Like, they're not super geniuses, and they're not, they're deeply, deeply flawed. And I would rather read about real people like that.
And it leaves room for much more interesting, complex characters. That way, when you're reading, you don't always know what's going to come next. You don't always know that it's like, it also leaves for great moments as a reader when you're like in your head internally screaming at the characters because they're making choices you don't like.
Right. And the other thing, as a writer, and I absolutely, Molly, I talk to my characters, right? Mm-hmm. Like I interview them. We banter things back and forth, and you get some of your best plot twists out of that interaction, right? So with Unthinkable, the book that I just had come out, there's a character who kept acting in certain ways, and I kept asking her, I'm like, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you being that way? Why aren't you talking to this person? Why aren't you doing that? And about a third of the way through the book, she finally told me. And it made for a mind-blowing twist at about the 2/3 point of the novel, right? And it was wonderful. And it never would have happened if I just had a character who had been acting rationally, frankly. I'm a big believer in you put your characters on the stage. You know who they are. I mean, you do have to know them. Like, I can close my eyes and see them. I can hear their voices. I feel like I know what they're going to do in just about any situation. But then you have to let them go and do it, right? And you have to listen to them. And I'm still astounded, and I have to learn this lesson about 40 times a year. But I will be working on a scene that is suddenly not working, and I'll be like, why is this scene not working? Because inevitably, I'm trying to make the character do what I need them to do to serve the plot of the novel. And it's not what they would naturally do. And therefore, the scene doesn't work. But as soon as I let the character act in an authentic way, bang, the scene just snaps into place. And that is, yes, it is an absolutely terrifying way to write. But over the years, I've come to develop the faith that sometimes my characters have wisdom and know what's going on in ways that I don't.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've actually talked with people on the show a lot about that same kind of like phenomenon almost that happens with authors all the time, where it's like, I am listening to my characters. I've got to talk to them in order to make a realistic, well done story.
Yeah, of course, the first time I heard someone say that, I was at a writing conference, and it was a mixture of fiction and nonfiction. And I was there as a journalist for a nonfiction part. And I kind of popped into a fiction thing because I was interested maybe in dabbling in fiction someday. And there was some, tweedy guy with the elbow patches on his jacket up on the dais. And somebody said, well, how do you know what happens next? And the guy said, well, my characters tell me where the story is going to go. And I can remember thinking, yeah. do your characters tell you you're a nut job? Because that's what you sound like right now. And, here I am all these years later, and I'm basically 2 elbow patches being away from being that guy. Because yes, my characters tell me where the story is going to go.
Well, he was right, because that is what happens. I think it's such an interesting thing to look at too, and in your own writing, trying to tap into that. All right. Well, I just have one last question for you today, and that is, what do you have coming up?
So it is possible it will change, because it has not been through the editing process yet. But it basically, and Molly, see, you've trapped me. I'm so good at my elevator pitch, right? Every book I do. So like the elevator pitch for Unthinkable is he is an ordinary stay-at-home dad who is told that either he has to kill 1 billion people. I'm sorry. See, now I'm screwing up the elevator pitch now, but he is told that either 1 billion people will die or he has to kill his own wife, right? Good elevator pitch. You go, oh, that sounds interesting. So I'm not slick with the elevator pitch for a book I call Invisibles. But basically the premise is there is this heretofore unknown hominin species that has been hiding in plain sight on a Pacific island for the last 15,000 years. So they are human, but they're not quite us. Right. And if you know the history of evolution and whatnot, you know that there were once upon a time on this planet's history, there were many hominin species that were sort of like us, but not quite us. Right. And so the premise is one of these species actually did not go extinct as we thought. And they're on this Pacific island. And I'm going to throw an anthropologist and 4 trained killers onto the island with them. And how could possibly anything bad happen out of that, Molly? I mean, it's clearly going to end perfectly for them.
That sounds fascinating. And if you want to come back on to talk about that, you are welcome to come back on the show anytime. And we can talk about that book, because that sounds so cool.
So it's called Invisibles. Hopefully it will come out sometime in 2022. It'll probably have like a different title by then and everything like that. But yes, I would be happy to be back on your show anytime.
That is so cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for chatting with me.
Of course. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Brad Parks.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end. Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast, and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.